What's up guys, this is Casey and I'm bringing you a Blender tutorial. I say that with a question mark because it's not really a tutorial, it's more of an information section. I'm going to be talking about Cycles materials today, and there will be a lot of tutorials to come later. I just thought I'd give sort of an introduction on Cycles materials today, so you really don't need to follow along. I'm not going to bother with screencast keys or anything like that. Let's go ahead and dive right in. So first things first, I'm in Cycles Render, obviously, if we're doing materials in Blender Cycles. So first off, let me talk about the different types of materials. First of all, I guess you really need to kind of think of what's going to be best for your project. If you're doing like a cartoon style, or if you're looking for realistic, or if you want futuristic, it really can make a big difference in what kind of material you're going to choose and how you want to proceed with what materials you're going to make. So let me go ahead and get started by adding a material to my cube. And there's just one there. Let's add that and go to our compositor. Okay, so this is a basic material for Cycles. It is just a shader connected to the material. And if I go to my rendered view, obviously I can change the color, and it's very basic. It's just a diffuse shader. So I can add a few things in here like a glossy shader and a mix shader to get a diffuse and a glossy mix, something like this. Which doesn't look too spectacular right now. Obviously there's nothing to reflect off of it for the glossy surface, but you get the idea. This is what I like to call the basic material for Cycles. I'm not using anything spectacular, anything fancy. There's very few times that you're ever going to use something this basic, this small, this easy in Blender. So let's go ahead right into the next one, which is going to be our photographic realistic material for Cycles. So I have one saved. Let me see if I can find it here. Open recent photographic material. I'm going to pop this open and show you. It's nothing too fancy. There we go. Okay, it's nothing too fancy. I basically just have an image texture, which is this image right here, followed by a normal map of this image right here, and a specularity map of, you guessed it, this image right here. I also have one more thing, which is a displacement modifier. If I zoom in real close, you can probably see that there are all these little bumps and grooves in here. And this is going to be my basic photorealistic texture, or material, whatever you want to call it. So let me go to my render view. And there you have it. So I've basically turned this plane into a three-dimensional old dirty wood floor. It reflects light in just the right places. It has bumps in all the right places. It has grooves. It has these little rivets in here, and it looks a lot more interesting than if I were to just paste it on there without any of the extra stuff. So this is our photorealistic. Now, there are some advantages and some disadvantages to doing photorealistic materials in Cycles. The advantage is that you can get very realistic looking materials, obviously. If you look at this, it looks like a dirty wooden floor. It looks very close to what I was trying to get, and that's great. You'll probably use this method a lot in doing your scenes in Blender. However, there are a lot of drawbacks to using this. One of them is that you have to unwrap all of your objects in your scene, which is basically, so if I go back to my default, it's already unwrapped, but I would tab into it, and I would hit U to unwrap, and then I would simply unwrap it. I'm not going to do it again, but I'll show you. So you have to unwrap every object in your scene. Now on a plane, something like this, it's really super easy. Not a big problem. However, if you have something more complex, a lot of curves or a lot of different sides to it, a lot of small details, then it starts to become a problem. In the same light, if I go back to my compositor, there are a lot of times where something like this just isn't going to be enough. Let's say I wanted to add some grunge or some dust or footprints or something on top of this. Really the only way to achieve this is if I go over here to my vertex tab and my UV maps, I would have to add another UV map, rename it, if it'll let me. Okay, go back to solid so it'll move. Here we go. So let's do footprints. Excuse me. So I've renamed it footprints. So now basically what I would have to do is I'd have to add an input UV map node and select my original UV map and place it into every single one of the vectors for these. And then to add my new footprints layer, I would have to now add an input UV map again, select my footprints layer, and then I would have to go from there. So image texture into something like this, and then would do like a diffused texture. I hit the wrong button. There we go. We would plug that in, and then you'd use another mix shader, pop that over here, and you'd pull this in, and you'd pull that in, and then you'd put this into your final material output, and that would give you footprints. If I open an image texture with footprints on it or something, it would basically lay it over the top of this with maybe a little bit more fancy work. However, you get the idea. Basically, it requires a UV map differently for each image that you're going to use. So that's a huge downfall. There's a lot of time involved. Unwrapping can be a pain, and it can be very tricky if there's curves or non-even surfaces. Another issue is just finding the images. There are a lot of websites out there that give you archives of these stock images that are tileable, or if you really want them, they can be untileable. But a lot of times you have a vision in your head for your scene that you're looking for, and maybe you just don't find the image that you're looking for out there on the web. So it can be a problem. I would say 9 times out of 10 when I go looking, I end up settling for something that is close or that at least fits the purpose of what I'm looking for, but it wasn't quite what I wanted, just because it just doesn't fit the vision that I had in my head. So that's another big issue. Another upside to using this is that, technically speaking, even though it looks confusing with all these nodes, it's actually quite simple. I mean, I basically just have a couple of images, 2 shaders of diffuse and glossy, a normal map, which could be replaced with a bump map if you did it that way. I've mixed those together, and then with my second UV map, I would have another picture, a diffuse, and a mix shader. So it's really pretty simplistic when you think about it, and that makes it kind of nice if you're new to Blender or new to cycles. This is fairly easy to learn. You can figure it out pretty quickly. So that's a huge advantage to using the photorealistic method. Another bad thing about using photorealistic method is that to really get great results, you're going to need to use the displacement textures. Now sometimes you can get by this, especially if it's a distance picture where you're seeing the objects at a distance and it's not going to be a huge issue. However, if you're very up close to an object, you're definitely going to need that displacement texture, and the displacement texture has a lot of problems with it. See, now technically I should have added a subdivision surface modifier, put it before all of this, and probably put it up to a render of 3, because that gives me a lot more vertices. Now before I even started, what I did was I subdivided this. If I hit tab, you can see I subdivided it about 100 times. And that gives me a lot of those really small, minute details that are really important for what I'm doing. So if I go in here to my modifier tab, and let me pop this up another level, and you can see I'm starting to get a lot of really fine detail, and that's great. However, in big scenes, or even small scenes I suppose, it can be incredibly daunting, and it can hurt your computer, especially render times. It'll make your render times pretty outrageous. My computer's not great, so it's really hard to use this method. I usually have to find a way around it, or I have to find a different method of doing my materials, because it really takes a lot of computer resources in order to get this done. So that's another big downside to using this. The nice thing about using it is that you can get pretty realistic results, which I've already said. But a nice thing is that usually with this grunge sort of texture, a lot of times you can forego doing that just because the picture that you have is already pretty grungy. So if you look at this, I mean, it's already pretty dirty. So if you were looking for a dirty floor, you really wouldn't have to add more dirt to this because there's already a lot of dirt. A lot of times you can kind of squeeze by using pictures like this just because you don't have to add extra layers to it. It's already in the image. A bad thing about all this is that you usually have to size these for every unwrap that you do. There's a lot of downsides to it. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to move on to my next section. And that's going to be my procedural textures. Okay, so you can see here I just have a cube. What a procedural texture does is through math and generated textures that are generated by the computer, by random numbers, by mathematical equations, basically you are able to cover the cube or whatever your object is without unwrapping it with a texture. So that's a huge advantage already, is that you don't have to unwrap. If I tab into this, you can see over here there's no unwrap. There's nothing over here. I have not unwrapped this cube whatsoever. I haven't had to do anything spectacular to it. So what I have here in my compositor is a procedural material for walls. If you've ever looked really close up at walls, you'll see it's pretty bumpy, either with like rolled paint on the walls, or because it's got like a texture, like a stucco texture or something like that. That's kind of what this is. So let me take you through what I have. Pretty much starts with the diffuse, and all I've done to it is I've bump mapped it. However, with the bump map, what I've done is I've used procedural textures. So I have texture coordinates from the object, which is the position that it's going to take while figuring out how it's going to layer this on your object. We'll get into this a lot more later, so if this seems daunting right now, don't let it get to you, because we'll go over this in depth in another tutorial. However, I have this both connected to a noise texture and a Musgrave texture. And you might be kind of wondering, how do I know what is what? Well, let me show you. Let me go to the rendered view mode. And what we have right now is our wall texture. So from far away, the cube doesn't look a whole lot different than what it would normally look. However, if you look closely, there's a very light texture on top of it. So let me zoom in on it here and show you up close what I'm talking about. Okay, so you should be able to see it from here. There's a lot of grooves and indentations going on this cube. Get even closer. There we go. Now you can see it real good. There's a lot of bumps, and it looks a little leathery, I guess, but it's more of a wall texture. And of course, you scale that way down, you pull way out, and from a distance it just looks like a textured wall. You would think, honestly, that it doesn't make a huge difference, but it really, really does when it's in the back of a scene. If you're looking at a wall, it really pulls it forward to look realistic like a wall instead of just being flat one color. So this is a great thing for that. So if you're ever wondering what the textures are going to do before you actually try to turn it into a procedural texture, there's a pretty simple way of doing this just by connecting it directly to your diffuse shader. So if I plug my Musgrave into here, you can see what the texture actually looks like before applying it anywhere. or applying any color to it. If I plug my noise texture in there, you can see what the noise texture looks like. And that's the noise texture. And then if I want to see what they look like combined, I can always just pull this one in, pop that into the color, and you can see what that looks like combined. So now all I got to do is just cut that off, and I'm right back to my wall texture the way I had it. These can be incredibly difficult. I'm not going to lie to you, these are for advanced users only. This is actually one of the most simple ones that you can get. But of course it can get incredibly difficult, especially when you have to start making your own nodes to put in here. But I'm definitely going to make an entire tutorial or 2 or 3 just on procedural textures. I'm going to try and help you guys learn how to do it so that you guys can hopefully create your own procedural textures, because there are a lot of advantages to using. So a huge advantage to using procedural textures is that you no longer have to unwrap your object before you apply the procedural texture, because it's using all sorts of algorithms and math, and I'm just throwing terms around. Don't call me out on them. Anyways, you can basically just apply them to anything without unwrapping them, which is great. That means you no longer have to search through your scene for that one little object that you missed in the unwrapping process or applying the material to or anything like that. You can just apply it and be done. Another thing that it's good for, and let me switch to my default view to show you this, is that it's really good for complex objects. So if I go into edit mode, and I'm going to subdivide it 10 times, oops, not one time, 10 times, there we go. I'm going to go to face select mode and select random, and I'm just going to extrude and scale. Something like that. So this object, if you were trying to do it photorealistically, you would basically have to go in and find every surface, every flat surface, like this surface here, and this surface here, and this one here, and you'd have to unwrap it individually to make sure that you get the correct sizing and the correct perspective on the image that you're applying to it. However, with procedural textures, you no longer have to do that. So let me go right into my rendered mode, and let me find where my light is best. Right about here, and I'll zoom way in here and show you. If it ever decides to go and render for me. Okay, we can really start to see it here now. Without doing anything spectacular or anything substantial to my object, everything still looks exactly the same as it did before. You still have the wall texture on the inside, and it looks like it's not stretched, it's not wrong. It looks the same as the front side. Inside this little hole right here, you can see it's in here, it's on the ledges. It's applied it everywhere to this object perfectly without any special unwrapping or fiddling with this object. Honestly, that's probably the biggest upside to using procedural textures. However, a downside to using procedural textures is that if you get it wrong, it's very easy to get it wrong, and if you get it wrong, it will look incredibly unrealistic. Now, there are a lot of resources out there available to show you how to make a lot of really good procedural textures. I would probably say it's best to go through and make them yourself, just because you learn faster. But if you want to go out there and just download one, you can do that. They have them on Blend Swap, and there's a couple of material libraries out there that have them. There's also a lot of forums that will show you how to make these. They can get incredibly complicated, I'm just warning you right now, and the most complicated ones are usually the ones that look the best. So there are definitely good sides and bad sides to using procedural textures. Another bad side to using procedural textures is that it's hard to get a grunge look, a good grunge look. As you can see, everything looks really nice and random and kind of busted up, which is good. However, there's no grunge, there's no cracks or crevices, there's no dirt anywhere on this, so that's something that I would probably have to go back through and either add a new procedural texture for, or I would have to add a photorealistic grunge texture on top of. which kind of defeats the purpose a little bit, but it does save a little bit of time, especially in these incredibly intricate details of an object. So like I said, there are definitely good things and bad things about a procedural texture. So let's go ahead and go to our next texture, or our next material, which is going to be our hand-painted material. So this is the hand-painted material. Obviously there's nothing on here yet. I'm going to have to probably redo it because I forgot to save it. So let's go ahead and show you what I did in the compositor. This is it. This is all I've added. It's an image texture to the diffuse shader and the material output. All I've done is down here I went and clicked new, which isn't down here anymore because I have untitled up, to create this black texture in the background. I have opened the black texture in my image texture, and then all I've done is I went in and unwrapped my cube, and if I go to my UV image editor, usually it will be on view and it will look like this. I can click on this and go to paint, hit my T to open up my toolbar, and I can now paint all over it. So let me show you a little bit of how this works. Let me up the scale of this a little bit. So let's say I want a circle on this side. Let's put an X on this side. Let's put a cross on this one. We'll put an A in this box. We'll put a T in this box. And we'll put an L in this box. And I can now go to my 3D view and show you how all of these have appeared. Now normally when you're painting that way, you would usually split your screen like this and go into your UV image editor. So this way you can kind of see, obviously my A is upside down, so I'd have to mess with that. I'd have to mess with my T because that's sideways. Obviously there's a lot of issues with it. However, I would say to get the most customized look that you can get for your object or for your scene is going to be with hand painting textures. Unfortunately, the biggest downside to this is that you kind of have to have a tablet for your PC to be able to draw correctly, and you kind of have to be good at art. And I'm not very good at art. I use Blender because I'm technically good at art, but I'm not good at just hand drawing. I'm not great with photography. I'm not good with most things. I'm good with numbers. I'm good with things that I can figure out and understand, logic. I'm not so great with the actual art side of things. However, I do use this on occasion, and I will show you why and how I use it. So let me just, where am I at? Where's my toolbox? Push my strength up a little bit here. And I'm just going to try and clear all of this off for a minute. One of the great uses of texture painting in this manner is actually for grunges and displacement maps. So let's say that this is a metal object and I want to put rust around all of these edges. What I would do is I would come in and do the same exact technique, and then I would just paint around the outer edges like this. Now normally I would use a scratchy brush that I've created. I would mess around with the strengths a little bit more. I just want to kind of give you a general idea of how this works. But basically this is what you do. You just come in, you're kind of painting around all the edges. And there we go. So now that it's black and white, all I have to do is put rust around the outside edges and a regular metal on the inside, and it'll kind of fade in and out between the two. That's probably the biggest use that I have for it. However, if you've ever seen a Disney or Pixar CG movie, something like that, pretty much every texture that you're going to see in those CG movies are going to be hand-painted textures by a very skilled digital artist. There's a reason that they do that, because it's very, you can make it look any way that you want it to, You can customize it for everything that you want to make. It's probably got the most versatility. It's probably the easiest to get the results that you want. However, you have to be a good artist, so I don't really use it as much as I probably should. It's really the end-all, cure-all for all of your cycles materials, is doing the hand-painted. Unfortunately, if you're going for photorealistic, it may not be the best idea. It just kind of depends. Okay, so that's pretty much the ups and downs of all the different types of materials that you can make in cycles. Obviously, I didn't drag you along through any actual tutorials. Those will be coming. I'm working on a series right now of a bunch of different tutorials on how to make different textures for objects. And there will be procedural textures, there will be photorealistic textures, and there will probably be some hand painting involved. One of the first ones that I have coming up is going to be a rust tutorial, which will have a lot of what this is right here involved in it. So I hope you guys enjoyed, and I hope you learned a little bit more about the different material types. And if you're interested, you can always look it up on Google. There's a lot of forums out there that you can find more information on all of these. And keep a lookout for my next video, which will be a real tutorial on how to make a real texture.